from my own experience on Wall Street, I remember if there's a demand for a product, it's just like in the fashion industry. If women want X, the fashion industry will make X. On Wall Street, if there's a demand for Y, they will create Y.
As Mike Milken, our neighbor to the south here, so famously said, when the ducks quack, you've got to feed them. And that's exactly what Wall Street does.
So this was enormous demand for the securitized mortgages that Wall Street could sell mainly to Asia, but really all over.
All over the world, yes.
And I'm told that the worse the security, the further away they try and sell it.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, I bet that the worse the security, the riskier security, the higher the yield. So yes. I bet you would have higher demand for that. People lost their heads is usually what happens in these bubbles. And then, by the way, this isn't the first time.
This is a classic bubble.
This is a classic, asset price bubble. And people got carried away. They forgot what risk meant. They forgot what risky securities were. They forgot that there was any risk, whatsoever. It's not a coincidence that Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme fell apart at the same time, because once people woke up to what real risk was about, and the fact that you can't get 12% annualized returns year after year without risk, that they said, wait a minute, these things are risky. And by the way, the underlying mortgages that were, there were actually people who were supposed to pay their mortgages that were underlying these securities. Well, when people in California and Florida and the rest of the country couldn't pay the mortgage payments, these mortgages went into default. And the mortgage securities that they were built upon also went into default. And, they lost value extremely quickly.
You mentioned California being the origin of many of these mortgages. What it is, we have things called Nina mortgages here, no income, no assets. If you were breathing, you could get a mortgage. And
yes.
You don't have to be too bright to realize that these are very risky things, but people went for it. And you mentioned earlier that the investment bankers no longer had their personal assets at risk because these banks went public. If the banks that were making these mortgage loans had to keep those mortgage loans, they probably never would have made them, but they could ship them to Wall Street.
You mean the mortgage brokers, the banks that provide? Yeah,
that provided Nina loans.
Yeah, once upon a time, right? You had a community bank. It would go to Art Levine. Your friend, the banker, would say, are you credit worthy? Are you going to pay me back? And he'd make that decision. If he decided to make you a mortgage, he kept it on his books, and that was your relationship. You paid him your interest and principal payments, and he made you this loan, and that became an asset on his books. Well, because of what happened on Wall Street in the early 80s, the other thing Wall Street's very good at is financial innovation. So that same spirit that created Mike Milken and created the high-yield bond industry also created the securitization industry. A guy named Lou Ranieri at Salomon Brothers in the early 80s created what became the asset securitization business, which in effect is a good idea, just like high-yield bonds is a good idea, just like probably internet IPOs is a good idea. These ideas are good, but unfortunately, because of the compensation system on Wall Street, there's no one who knows to say enough is enough. And it's only after the bubble explodes that people say, well, maybe we got carried away too far.
And if you're the risk manager of one of these firms and you have some sense of doubt about where this is going, and you try and caution your partners not to go in that direction, you're not Mr. Popularity there.
And you probably won't have a job for very long. I mean, that's right. It's the nature of the beast. First of all, I think as Lloyd Blankfein has said, again, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, that the rest of Wall Street was not very good at risk management. And if anything, my book shows is, Bear Stearns had a risk manager and a risk management function, and it reported up through the chain of command, but it was worthless. There was nobody managing the risk. Nobody cared really about the risk. Nobody even conceived of the risks that this could end up being. They were focused on one thing: making money. The more profits, the better. And for a time, mortgage-backed securities were an incredibly profitable business. For a time, anybody who touched a mortgage made money on it.
What about the role or the role of lax government oversight? Let's assume that Wall Street always is motivated by greed. Shouldn't there be some government institutions that say, stop, you can't do this? And I think of one thing, the the change in regulations that allowed brokerage firms to go up to 40-to-1
Yes.
ratio of debt to capital.
Yes, yeah, that occurred in June 2004. The SEC, the regulator of Wall Street securities firms, allowed that to happen. With the quid pro quo, because they just weren't going to give it to them willy-nilly, the quid pro quo was that they were going to regulate them more intensely. They were going to actually have regulators from the SEC in these firms. But unfortunately, that's the part of the equation that they forgot. And it wasn't until August 2007, the same weekend that Jimmy Kane, the CEO of Bear Stearns, fired Warren Spector, the co-president of Bear Stearns, after they had both been playing bridge at a bridge tournament in Nashville. They came back, and Jimmy fired him. That same weekend, KKR, the private equity firm, was in Bear Stearns' office thinking about making an investment in Bear Stearns. And in the third room was the SEC. So from June of 2004 to August 2007, no one from the SEC had showed up. So they were allowed to have this huge leverage. And by the way, during the quarter, before they cleaned it up at the end of the quarter, it was like 50-to-1 leverage. They would clean it up at the end of the quarter so to make it look 30-to-1. But it was just, absurd.
Well, a lot of food for thought, and we'll be continuing with this marvelous conversation after we pause for these messages. We're continuing our conversation with Bill Cohan, author of House of Cards, A Tale of Hubris and Wretched Excess on Wall Street. Greed is the watchword on Wall Street, right? That's what
it's
you're
the
there
motivating
for.
force. Nobody's going to be working on Wall Street unless they're motivated. There's an altruism on Wall Street. I used to say that Wall Street was good one day a year, the year you got your bonus. And other than that, it's a very tough. Say what you will. They get paid way too much money.
Yes.
But it is a tough job. It's not like laboriously, back-breaking work like working in a salt mine. But it metaphorically has been described as a salt mine. You're up all hours of the day. You have to fly around the world on a moment's notice to make a stupid pitch about something.
And the way you keep score is how much you make.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Well, and of course, how much revenue you generate in any given year. So then at the end of the year, because of this wacky compensation system that we talked about, that you're always keeping track of the amount of revenues you generated, the amount of fees you generated. So that way, at the end of the year, you can say to your boss, hey, I worked on this deal, this deal, this deal, and this deal. I generated this much money. I want a big bonus.
What about the role of government in this? There'll always be people pushing for money and even going over the line with criminal activity. Shouldn't
Yes.
were the regulators asleep at the switch?
To some extent, the regulators were asleep at the switch, but to some extent, it's never been a fair fight. Think about it. You've got a bunch of regulators in Washington, and I don't want to ascribe behavior to them based on the fact that they might be government bureaucrats or trying to regulate these tigers and lions on Wall Street who get paid millions of dollars a year, who create a language that they barely can understand, let alone a regulator in Washington. And it's just the numbers don't work. The people on Wall Street are in business to evade and get around the Wall Street regulations, the Washington regulations, which, by the way, they help write. And the regulators in Washington are, if they don't want to go to Wall Street to begin with, because there's a revolving door between the two, and there always has been, then they're overwhelmed or befuddled, and they can't, figure it out. Now, yes, the regulators should have lived up to their part of the bargain from June 2004 on, when they allowed Wall Street firms to up their leverage. They said they were going to be in these firms regulating them, monitoring them, but they didn't do it.
There is a real anger out in Main Street, USA about what happened and the impact it's had. You referred to the unemployment earlier, the fact that the very banks that we bailed out are raising their credit card limits before the law changes, and it just seems unfair. We helped them survive, many of them, and yet they seem to be conducting business as usual.